Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second to last session of our recipient meeting. I'm Cassandra Pickens. I'm an epidemiologist and morbidity science officer at CDC, and I'll be moderating today's surveillance breakout session titled Going Beyond Standard Surveillance Methods to Understand the Environment of Drug Overdoses. Thank you for joining us today. We'll have three presentations. First, integrating equity data and actions into North Carolina's Overdose Data Dashboard, presented by Mike Fliss with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. Second, data integration and data dissemination, combining public health and public safety metrics on the main drug data hub, presented by Daniel Susi of the Margaret Chase Policy Center, University of Maine. And finally, creating a substance use vulnerability index in Michigan to inform program planning, by Gabrielle Stroh-Steiner at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. All of the speaker bios are available in the virtual meeting platform on the main landing page by clicking each of the presenters' names. Please feel free to enter any questions you have throughout as we're going in the Q&A box, and please specify which presenter you're addressing the questions to. Following all the presentations, I will moderate the Q&A, and you can also use the separate chat box to make comments, share resources, or discuss with other participants. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to our first presenter, Mike Fliss with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services.
Great, thanks, Cassandra. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right, I'll be talking about integrating equity data and actions into NC's Overdose Data Dashboard. First, I want to thank my, thank my co-builders of this dashboard, Mary Beth Cox, Megan Smith, and Amy Patel, and our many, many data partners. You'll hear more about them in a sec. So I'm going to start with an introduction to our opioid action plan framework to set the stage a little bit for integrating equity data with that project. It's a little bit of history and what brought us to what we're presenting today. So in June 2017, our governor launched the North Carolina Opioid Action Plan. There's a link to it if you're interested. Our first set of metrics, again now 5 years ago, were here. They come from a number of different data sources. Some typical ones from syndromic surveillance and death certificate related data like overdose related deaths. At the time it was opioid related deaths and the rate of opioid ED visits, but also data from our prescription drug monitoring programs and naloxone data. And we had captured this data at the state level. We then, at our locals' request, began producing a number of other data products about this collection of indicators, including some monthly surveillance products that got emailed out, or posted to listservs, posted on the web. Again, more just kind of views of the similar thing. You would get that by subscribing to, reaching out to substance use data at North Carolina, DHS.gov, and they were well received. But there was interest in building a dedicated website for local data. We first built that in our Shiny. This is a couple of quick screenshots from it. It was received well, worked on mobile phones really well, about 50,000 views. When we paused it, you'll see we moved to a different platform in a bit. But yeah, so this is our first build. So we took a bunch of feedback from that and continued to iterate on this project, this opioid action plan. So we heard that folks really wanted information in different, besides not just counties, different regions. So we have 4 or 5 different region types now in the dashboard that we'll share. Wanted easily downloadable data, still wanted to be accessible on a phone, tablet. We were previously updating quarterly, but folks found that a little bit confusing. That was in part for data suppression issues and some other things, but still, folks, quarters are strange. Folks did like the graphs and maps together and frequently used. So we decided to bump up to monthly data, make sure what we were producing was printable. People had a lot of questions about, yeah, this is great information, but what do we do about it? So on the overdose to action idea there, we really heard that on the ground from people. Some of the metrics were confusing, which we changed, and we tried to take lessons from our recent dashboards. So that includes, for instance, this alcohol and public health. This is one page of, I think, 15 that focus on different pieces of alcohol and public health. But it had maps and graphs and sort of a one-pager you could print out and take to a board meeting. And we did get a lot of requests to print our dashboards. So even though Tableau sometimes says nobody prints stuff anymore, we actually hear very differently about that. So we then moved to our third iteration of the dashboard. So released in 2019, we had then began grouping our indicators and, as you'll see in a second, local actions under these strategy headers. I'm not going to read all of these, but some were more non-medical drivers of health and stigma, are more typical surveillance tracking. So began sort of focusing and grouping things. And these local actions, which is the next 2 or 3 slides, were really the new piece of the dashboard 2.0. So those changes that flowed through to the actions and the metrics, now sort of older news, but we know that multiple substances were involved. It wasn't just opioids and overdoses. So illicit opioids became a bigger issue. So we began tracking that as its own metric. And we had more lessons learned about really how we wanted to communicate this to locals. So on to local actions. For each of our indicators, our more traditional sort of counts and rates and things, we wanted to encourage local impactful programs. So we did have some state guidance on what that meant, but also wanted to begin to actually do surveillance and promote whether locals did something or not. So for instance, naloxone distribution, if you distribute in all 3 of these settings at the local level, then we would call that a green. That's yes, or 1 or 100%, you're doing this thing. A yellow would be 1 or more settings, and red would be not doing any naloxone distribution at the local level. So local health departments would update us at the state level about that, and we collected that through an online survey. And our monthly dashboard updates based on that survey then pushed those, here's what you're doing, here's what your neighbors are doing. So the 3.0 metric or framework, which we're now at today, and I'm sharing sort of more about the center of that piece, the equity related data and local actions, was similar to our previous strategy framework. So to get into the weeds a little bit here, this is our full set of indicators integrated across many different data sets, as well as our local actions in the bottom. So for instance, reduced supply, we capture data on opioid pill dispensing, I should be specific about that, as well as the percent illicit deaths, and then data on whether or not a local organization at the county level has a drop box or is distributing fentanyl test strips are the associated local actions that we keep track of. And so there's a matrix of these data points and local actions. And that second to last, going to the right, around equity and lived experience are what we most recently added, which is med drug deaths by race, ethnicity, and then whether people with lived experience are involved in the planning of programs, and whether historically marginalized populations and community-based organizations are working together. So a couple of quick views then of the Opioid Action Plan dashboard, again, to give a sense of our what it really looks like in practice. We've got a welcome page with some videos and some intro text and well-curated, not too difficult to update over time. I think this slide's a little bit old, but currently says in 2021, here's the number of folks who have died today. It's really a high-level overview. We then get into the OAP itself, how it works, and what the strategies are and what the metrics are. There's a how to use page, so if people are confused or if they want to get direct access to the data and the metadata, which is now all posted there. There's a clicked walkthrough. You can just watch a video walkthrough to explain how it works. And then into the data itself. So there's a strategy page. And again, for the framework here, a strategy is 2 metrics and 2 actions, big picture. So in this case, we're looking at that track progress and measure impact. So you have for whatever local or state or region that you've selected, in this case, we're looking at North Carolina, you've got overdose deaths and overdose ED visits, and then whether or not there's a dedicated point person for overdose work in that county, and whether or not that county is using DHS resources in their data sharing. You can zoom in on individual metrics, basically get to a page that says, yeah, let's look at that metric and see what's happening on my local level compared to North Carolina at the rate, using rates. There's a lot of live text in here, so we use that concept, phrase as almost like a Mad Lib, if you remember that from old growing up. Basically, like taking key phrases and making sure we can swap out to build a sentence, so that people who are using the page, who are maybe not the same kind of graph literate, or just really work more with text, or want to be able to say a sentence aloud, they know how to use that metric in a sentence because of that. Local actions then also have their own dedicated pages. So there are interactive controls here. You can pick your location or pick the local action you want to zoom in on. We'll let you know what the definition of a yes, you're doing this is, and as well as share any local notes that were shared. That's often like the address and phone number of your syringe exchange program, or so anything local that somebody wants to look up, we can get that in the notes field. Okay, so that's where we were about 6 months ago. And so it's been about a 5-year effort to get to where we're at. We wanted to add more data on disparities, and not just data, but also some local actions on that. So one of the first things we did was review our set of 14, 16, I guess it is now, local, maybe more traditional surveillance metrics, counts and rates and percents of things, and considered how they would perform as a decent disparity tracking metric. That's not the only way to think about equity, but a place for us to start. So that's questions about how timely is the data, what can be available, what about small numbers and data suppression at the county level or even the sub-county level, especially or the region level, 2 or 3 counties together. These concepts are often very challenging to convey to folks who are maybe not epidemiologists, but want to get the big picture. So are we conveying rate ratios, rate differences? How do you compare 2 groups within the same place? And then how do you compare peer counties to themselves, or to neighbors, for instance? Is the county greater than the state? These are all kind of classic understanding disparities questions, but a given data set may or may not perform very well as understandable and timely on this. So we ended up settling on a relatively traditional metric of overdose-related deaths for a bunch of reasons. We first build the state story, that one pager is here on the right. So that includes some, the line graph at the top I actually want to focus on a little bit here. It might be probably hard to read, but some of the punchlines from that graph are that there's both a comparison of our current rates among groups, in this case, groups by race, ethnicity. So which one has the higher rate, which group has higher rates. But then we also have dynamics like for Black non-Hispanic people who live in North Carolina, that rate is increasing faster. And we're not getting into calculus when we're communicating this to people. So we want to find some way to communicate what faster rate changes or getting worse faster, an increase in deaths that's faster than others. We need simple phrases for that. And then local actions here are broad concepts, but we wanted locals to be reporting to us and sharing what they're doing on these 2 concepts here. So that's centering people with lived experiences in their work. What does that look like for them? And then community-based organizations that serve historically marginalized populations. So while we were building that, there's a different team addressing visualizing our data and money related to the opioid settlement. So I'm going to zoom in on one page of that. I also built that wearing a different hat, working with the Department of Justice here. But we want to integrate lessons from other dashboards into our visualization. So I got a number of other dashboards here: alcohol, motor vehicle crash, VDRS dashboard. So a couple of wins or we thought like improvements to our visualization. We got a lot of feedback that fewer controls on our dashboards are better. Folks want to pick one thing and not have to break it or figure out, oh, there's 3 things I got to click in the right way. Our live text is cleaner, I think, on that other dashboard. So I'll try to read. Yeah, so the overdose death rate in Alamance County was 25 out of 100,000 people in 2020. This represents 42 people in Alamance who died from overdose in that year. So we keep those phrases, those key phrases for that metric, and we've got many metrics, in a separate table of metadata, and we could do that in the Q&A, talk about that some. But that way we're able to swap in those phrases to make a very readable sentence for somebody who's new to the material. There's some custom color ramping that does a better job with kind of my classic map problem. If you look at 1 year and it's spread all the values apart, then it doesn't seem like actually everybody's high this year. And how do you handle that? So there's some custom color work and a simpler line graph. And we just found that feedback worked well based on feedback. So just a few more slides. So our comms team put together a simple, but we thought very useful way to think about these two dynamics of comparing two rates and then comparing two increases in those rates. So for American Indian Indigenous populations in North Carolina, the 2020 rate of 83.6 overdoses per 100,000 people, overdose deaths per 100,000, is the highest rate. That is also represents a 93% increase over the previous year statewide. And we can talk about those two numbers, the 2020 rate, and compare, as well as compare that increased number. So we used that to develop this local story page, though we did have to make some modifications, which I imagine these probably are issues across lots of states. So we ended up using 5-year rates to reduce our rate suppression problems in small counties or small populations in small counties, right? So we're talking about subpopulations at the county level or region level, and that's tough. That gets really small really fast. Our death data doesn't actually require data suppression, but it's best practice for us not to be communicating too much about very, very small, a rate based on one person, right? So that's why we're using 5-year denominators here and trying to communicate that. Again, we've got live text trying to read data for people to understand, so that they can understand how to engage with it. And then also communicating that percent change in a very clear way. It's up 146% in this county. And what does that mean? So this is my last sort of data slide. We have spent a number of years trying to really figure out what Tableau formats work best. We do a lot of prep in SAS and R of all these different data silos into one data table and mash that through into Tableau. And we're finding a lot of wins with having metadata in a separate table about definitions and key phrases on how to build a sentence with that indicator. And we're continuing to do work in this area. So that's it for me. And I'm going to turn over to the next presenter. Thanks so much.